A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. We are continuing with, and in fact, this will be the last night of exploring chapter 8 in my book, Accepting What Is. I think these discussions have been incredible, and I really appreciate how Roger and Thom Rutledge and Tom Potash and Herb Kagan have sweetened the pot as we talk about these things. It's really fun to do this with you guys because the chapters come to life for me. And as I mentioned last time, and if you were here and a part of that group, this chapter particularly touched me very deeply in terms of my work as a psychotherapist. And I just wanted to reflect a minute on what Charlene experienced. And for those of you that weren't here, just a quick summary of what happened in that psychotherapy experience with Charlene is that I had been treating her for some time. She had a daughter that she was very close to, and when her daughter was quite young, she was diagnosed with a tumor on her kidney. And they removed the one kidney and they put her through extensive treatment, I think both radiation and chemotherapy. And she was given a fairly good prognosis at that point in time. And for several months, things seemed to be going well. None of the CAT scans or SPECT scans showed any kind of cancer returning. But then one day her daughter came home from school and started complaining of a backache. And the cancer was back. And it was bad news because there was no treatment for her at this point in time. And this beautiful young lady was going to die from cancer. And, you can understand what it was like for Charlene. She was devastated. Watching her daughter suffer and to feel powerless, watching someone suffer that you love and care about, especially if it's a child and you're powerless to do anything to help them, may be one of the most difficult experiences in life. And it was for her. She struggled terribly with this and was in great pain. And she kept trying to figure out a way of how can I in some way wrap my head around this experience, right? How could she, because she understood, the part in the several first editions of the big book where they've got Dr. Paul's story and talks about acceptance. That acceptance is the key to our recovery. There's so much truth in that. But when people in a meeting would throw into her face that nothing happens in God's world, that's not a mistake. She just couldn't accept a God like that it did not soothe her to think of things that way. In fact, it felt like it was a real empathic failure for people to even share those things with her. And it started to alienate her a lot from a great source of comfort and support that she had for many, many years. And none of those people did it with bad intentions. Nobody was meaning to hurt her, but it had no solace for her to tell her that that nothing's happens in God's world. That's a mistake. For her, this was a terrible mistake. And any God that would do this to an innocent little girl was not a God that she wanted in her life. And that's how she struggled with it. So, what do I do as a psychotherapist? How do I show up and how do I try to provide a space for Charlene to be able to work through this horrible, terrible experience that she's having in her life? And of course, one of the things is try to sit there and to try to put myself in her shoes. And so I would do that. And many of the sessions we would just cry together. There would be no words that could be exchanged that would be helpful in any way other than having someone in the experience with her that could sit with her and allow the depth of her pain to create sounds and to allow those sounds to happen, to create a space where she could be herself completely and 100% without any of those shoulds. I shouldn't be making sounds like this. I shouldn't cry like this, or I should handle this better, or whatever other nonsense we might tell ourselves in that kind of a situation. But I think the real turning point in my work with Charlene was not in helping her have acceptance for the situation that she was in, but to express her non-acceptance of the situation she was in. To let her rage about how wrong this was and how terrible it was. To let her have an experience that Job had with God, and to sit there and expostulate with God about how, what are you doing? How come you're taking my child? I hate you for this. How could you do this to me? To let her voice every part of her that couldn't stand the experience and didn't want to be going through it. And every time she gave voice to not wanting to accept this, to hating the experience she was in, and to saying, I will never accept this. I will never be able to be okay with this. She got a micro or a millimeter closer to accepting it and to being able to live with it. It's the opposite of what we think. And that's one of the things when I say, well, what did Charlene teach us in this chapter with what she went through? Is that we get to acceptance by going through our non-acceptance, by not accepting the situation that's unacceptable, by hating the situation, by giving voice to that, by declaring our outrage and our anger about what's happening, how unfair it is, and to rage about that. Without anybody saying, try to be reasonable. Forget reason in this situation. No reason is going to comfort her. There's no comforting a person with reason in a situation like this. So she really had to express all of that unwillingness to accept the situation to move closer to acceptance. And I think that that's a very important thing for us to underscore when we're thinking about any issue we're struggling with that we're having a hard time accepting it. Write down all the reasons why you'll never accept it. Write down what it would mean if you accepted it and what would make it hard to accept it. What ideas you'd have to give up about yourself if you accepted that situation. What ideas would you have to give up about life if you accepted that horrible situation that you're confronting and facing in your life? I think that's an important task for any of us that are stuck with a situation that we don't want to accept. I did that when I was first in recovery in terms of dealing with the loss of my father at 11. I didn't want to accept that. I didn't want to live a life and face a life that meant I wouldn't have a dad around to turn to and to be connected to. And I had he was a wonderful father, and his loss, created a tremendous, I felt lost, completely lost after I lost him for a long time in my life until recovery started. Then I started to recover little bits and pieces of myself through the years. Well, what is another thing that um, Charlene is teaching us as she goes through her experience of metabolizing or digesting this experience that she had in her life? Well, I think the other lesson, there's two other ones that I want to highlight here, and then I want to read a portion of that chapter that I didn't read last time. And one of them is that Charlene did what I think we all do, is that we think that we can take today's reality and copy it like you did on a Word document, and then cut it and paste that into tomorrow. That somehow things aren't going to change, even though if we said that out loud, we'd know how absurd that sounds. That we just go like day to day, moment by moment, thinking that things are going to be the same. And I think that that's a desire for us to have certainty and some control in our life. And it's a setup because we're totally unprepared for what we think is the unexpected, when what it is just a part of what life is. Life is change. Nothing's the same. My word changes from moment to moment. You change from moment to moment. This moment always moves to the next. There's no such thing as a here and now. A here and now is always moving to next. So that's one thing that Charlene taught us. You cannot paste today into tomorrow. Tomorrow will be whatever tomorrow will be. And the more we can show up for that and to embrace it and to deal with it as it is, the better we're going to learn to cope with life, and the more mature we're going to become. Like Nan was talking about, real maturity and balance. Well, how do you get to the real maturity? Well, growing up means learning how to face some of the things we don't want to face. That's a big part of it. The second thing that I think that Charlene showed us and really demonstrated in terms of the ways that she dealt with this situation and the vulnerability she brought into my office, was that many of our expectations have very, very deep roots to them, that they lie in our unconscious. And until we encounter certain situations, we may not even realize we have an expectation about something. But it goes back to what Bill Wilson said when he was talking about step 10, and he was said that it's a spiritual axiom that every time we're disturbed, I like to replace the word disturbed with off. Every time we're disturbed, we'll go with what Bill said today because it fits with this situation. There's something off with us, not wrong with us, but there's something off with us. And I think what's off is that we are not aligned with reality. And as I said, to get aligned with reality means to object to being aligned with reality. I don't want to be aligned with reality. I don't like reality. I remember I had an assignment when I was in undergraduate at Cal State University, Long Beach, and it was an experimental psychology class. I think the first section of that, and we had a task. We had to go to the different bathrooms and write down the different forms of graffiti that, or the different graffiti we found on the bathroom walls, and then come back and then start to put it so like the art department and psychology department, you know, physical education and stuff like that, to see were there any differences in terms of the kind of graffiti that was showing up in the different departments. And I had to smile because in the psych department, somebody had scribbled on the bathroom door, said, reality is for those people who can't handle drugs. Reality is for those people who can't handle drugs. I laughed at that because I really understood what that meant. Um, so I think those are a couple of things but there's many other things that Charlene can teach us. But I just wanted to read to you the one section I didn't read last week that I think is an important section to read. So let me take off my glasses so I can see this just a little bit better, because the light's not great in here and I don't want to hobble over to the light switch tonight. This is on page 148, acceptance and self-acceptance. Acceptance comes in two types: acceptance of the world as it is, and more specifically, acceptance of who we are as individuals. Acceptance is one of the big ideas of recovery, right? This is one of the great challenges we face, accepting that life is what it is. When we struggle with addiction, we struggle with the idea that we are powerless, not just over our capacity to use or not use some substance. We struggle with our powerless over everything around us too. We struggle with our powerless over life, our unmanageability, right? Much of our work in recovery and in achieving emotional sobriety involves letting go of our crazy-making desire to control things. We have to accept the world on its own terms, not on our terms. We will discuss this big idea later in the chapter as it is crucial to Charlene's crisis. For now, I want to focus on self-acceptance. Self-acceptance is a special flavor of acceptance. It is about understanding who we are at our truest moments, accepting all that we are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Is it about understanding our strengths and weaknesses and acting in accord with both? This is a tough job. Admitting our powerlessness is the start of self-acceptance because it forces us to accept that we can't control our addictive behavior and that our lives have become unmanageable. Second half of that first step, by the way, is the most difficult. And it's something that is ongoing. I think the first half we can take 100%. But accepting that our lives have become unmanageable reaches far beyond the impact of our addiction. It speaks to the fact that we have created a foundation for our lives that doesn't work, a foundation that is fragile and creates an unmanageable life, a foundation built upon emotional dependence. When we accept that our problems are of our own making, that we have built our lives upon a shaking foundation, we can begin the process of real change. So, self-acceptance is the foundation for solid recovery. Without self-acceptance, there can be no change, no honesty, no physical sobriety, and no emotional sobriety. Self-acceptance is the basis for having a nourishing relationship with ourselves. When we accept ourselves, we become our own ally. Those of you that were with us when we explored Dr. Brandon's ideas of self-acceptance understand that self-esteem can be thought of as the utter refusal to have an adversarial relationship with ourselves. And that's what we're talking about here, is the utter refusal to be in an adversarial relationship. We are on our side of the struggles because we accept ourselves as we are, not as our false self tells us we should be. Self-acceptance means we can shed the extra pressures of the shoulds that constitute our false self. If we lack self-acceptance, if we are not on our side, then it will be hard to support our recovery. It will be easy to give in to the addict self when it pressures us to drink again. But when we are on our side, we protect ourselves and we honor our integrity, our safety. Dr. Nathaniel Brandon, to whom I've referred to many times in this book, thought of self-acceptance simply being for ourselves. So underscore that, being for ourselves. He went on to define self-acceptance as a refusal to have an adversarial relationship to myself. If we refuse to be in an adversarial relationship with ourselves, then it becomes quite evident that self-acceptance requires self-support. We support ourselves, our growth and our maturity. We support ourselves so we can learn from our mistakes rather than judge, criticize, or shame ourselves for not being perfect. We ultimately support ourselves by having faith in our ability to grow, to become what we can be, to become whole, to mature, to become differentiated. Self-acceptance gradually wears down the prison of our false self. It erodes the shoulds from which we build our own prison walls. Self-acceptance is rooted in authenticity, integrity, and honesty. These elements combine to form a sort of kryptonite that weakens the control of our false self. You guys remember that from Superman, right? Kryptonite, that was his one weakness, right? Remember, our false self is built of expectations we swallowed whole, thinking that if we met them, we would keep ourselves lovable. We cannot be authentic and honest and still fulfill the demands of our false self. Fulfilling those demands is essentially dishonest and requires that we be manipulative. In many ways, self-acceptance is outrageous. It challenges the rules imposed by the tyranny of the shoulds. It creates a revolution. It is the means by which we dethrone the false self and recover our lost true self. It is a step towards our emotional freedom, towards our emotional sobriety. I like to think of self-acceptance operates like a calibrating mechanism. It brings us into alignment with who we really are. Dr. Fritz Perls understood the importance of acceptance in addressing a personal problem. He spelled it out this way: as long as you fight a symptom, it will become worse. If you take responsibility for what you are doing to yourself, how you produce your symptoms, how you produce your illness, how you produce your existence, that very moment you get in touch with yourself, that's when growth begins. That's when integration begins. When Pearl says take responsibility for what you're doing to yourself, he is referring to a kind of acceptance. He invites us to accept that we have been the builders of our own prison. This is radical self-acceptance. Recall that in stage 1 recovery, we achieve sobriety. Stage 1 requires us to admit our powerlessness over alcohol, over our addiction, or if you'd like, over our addict self, so we could achieve physical sobriety. Self-acceptance is born at the moment we truly admit that we are powerless and that our lives have become unmanageable. It was at this moment that we began, even slowly, to embrace who we truly are. The admission of powerlessness, in turn, helped us find a healthier source of power to achieve physical sobriety. The admission that our lives had become unmanageable created an experience of humility, which is necessary if we are going to do the psychological work we need to do to achieve emotional sobriety. Now, please don't think of self-acceptance as something that just happens. It is something we do. We won't admit or own a problem if we don't first accept we have it. Self-acceptance helps us begin to align ourselves with reality with recovery. Being aligned with reality of our fatal condition, our addiction, is a critical step in all recovery. As Bill Wilson stated, little good can come to any alcoholic who joins AA unless he first accepted his devastating weakness, his alcoholism and his addiction, and all its consequences. But this isn't as easy as it sounds. We don't like to admit we are powerless. There are many forces at work that make it hard for us to accept ourselves as we are. As Bill Wilson stated, our natural instincts cry out against the admission of powerlessness, but they cry out against the admission of a lot of things in life. And this is why I was making that point before, is that if you really want to get to acceptance, start by not accepting what's going on. We developed our false self to gain power over our environment so we wouldn't be rejected, we wouldn't be unacceptable or be unloved. We wanted to control and manipulate people to get them to respond to us as we wanted them to. Admitting powerlessness threatens the very nature or construct of the false self. It means we don't have the power to control. Well, that's a crisis for all of us, isn't it? If you're reading this book, you are likely either an addict or someone who loves an addict. That is, you're already in recovery and you've struggled with powerlessness and self-acceptance. There's a reason we resist self-acceptance. It threatens who we think we should be. Who we think we should be is our false self, and we mistakenly believe that our false self will make us feel safe in the world. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. You cannot feel safe in the world because you cannot act on your own behalf when you're not accepting what is. So I thought that that would be a nice way to wrap up this discussion about talking about the importance of not accepting things to get to acceptance in our life. It's paradoxical, but you know, the truth of it is all of our recovery is paradoxical. We find power by admitting our powerlessness. We start to learn to manage our life by accepting that we've become unmanageable in our life. So with that being said, let me open up the room and invite Roger and Thom to join me. And, you know, you guys see me rocking because I'm sitting here in about a pain level of about 5. So I'm trying to soothe myself at the same time, trying to talk to you guys. So, or I might be on the spectrum. I'm not sure which it is yet.
No. It doesn't matter whether you're on the spectrum or not. Rocking works.
It does help. Rocking.
I learned it from a social worker in my first job out of college, and I realized this woman that was really an amazing therapist and social worker. She would sit in these boring ass meetings, and she would be rocking all the time. And I asked her about it because I knew schizophrenics tend to rock, and we had a lot of that. And she said, I just learned it from the schizophrenic. She said those meetings bore me so much. I need to soothe myself. So, Roger.
Okay.
Now, go ahead, Thom. Any thoughts? You can go ahead
Well,
and kick it off.
well, real quickly, because we're talking about experimental psychology. My lab partner and I, we had this pigeon, and his name was Pinhead. And it was it was a good name for him, Pinhead. And he was supposed to learn to tell the difference between female and male faces and pictures. He couldn't do it at all. So what we did is we snuck into the lab when nobody else was there and fed all the other pigeons so that they weren't hungry for reinforcements when my partners, when our classmates came in. And I got to say, Pinhead still did not learn. We gave him everything. We did everything for him, and I still hold resentment for that little pigeon named Pinhead. I may need to work on it. So, here's the thing. I got two things I want to touch on because this is the last night doing the acceptance thing.
I think that has
One
something
is
to do with acceptance. So, Thom, I do think Pinhead has definitely taught you a lesson about acceptance in life, or is trying to teach.
Oh no, I have not accepted that.
No, you have not, not accepted. Pinhead's
No.
utter refusal to cooperate with that
No,
experiment.
I'm bringing that up 40 something years later for a reason. It's and I doubt seriously, if I think about it, I doubt, Pinhead's probably pretty old by now. And I'd probably forgive him. But okay, the first thing that I want to re-emphasize before we get off this subject is what you were saying that Fritz Perls talks about with the resistance. What you resist persists, and it's in the way that we talk about it a lot, Alan, is through that negative command. And in hypnosis, it's called the negative command, and this is one of the things that when we're working toward the reason we need to be in an acceptance is because when we don't, one of the things we do is we approach our attempts to change in very ineffective, sometimes pretty stupid ways. And a lot of times it's trying to get rid of something, it's trying to change something that we can't. And so it is like, don't think of the color blue. And if I say that, then you can't do anything else. You don't imagine, Alan with a Raggedy Doll wig on, which everybody here has now done. It's like, because the only thing I know neurologically is the brain doesn't encode negative. And so that's one of the reasons we need to do acceptance, because we're going to have to say, I am thinking of the color blue and I don't want to think of that. So what am I going to do? I'm going to focus more on the color yellow, or it's always about what's next, moving on. And the other thing I want to just touch on quickly is, because you talked about the first step, and this is an important thing, because we get to the first step, it's power. We're powerless. And it's like, I've known so many people who seem to take that as we're powerless over everything. We're not. The first step says we're powerless over alcohol, or the way I say it, I'm powerless over my addiction. There's a lot of things I can plug in there that I do, but I'm not powerless over everything. Now it's not, I can't control a lot of things, but I do have power of influence. And so one of the things I always like to point out to people about the first step, which is a good example to give us a little encouragement about what acceptance does for us, is which Roger, I get it from Roger, but I think he got it from Nathaniel Brandon, that acceptance is always the first step to change. But the two parts of the first step, as you mentioned, Alan, one is permanent. It's I am powerless over my addiction. I'm powerless over alcohol. 38 years into my sobriety, I am just as powerless over my alcoholism as I was the day that I quit drinking. It's that's the case. The second part, if I fully see, this is the cool thing, if I fully accept the first part, that I'm powerless over that, and if I fully accept that because I have resisted that, my life, I fully accept the unmanageability of my life, that second part is actually reversible. You know, I would not describe, I mean, there's a lot of things that I don't control in my life, but I don't describe my life as unmanageable today. You know, I am managing it. I am in charge and I am managing it, but it only comes about when we practice acceptance. So we're not just, we're accept, the point being acceptance is not about just giving up. It's not about throwing your hands in the air and saying, well, I can't do anything about that. No, it's a very powerful way to move forward. Amen.
Mm. Amen.
Well, let me just share my screen. I just want to show a picture of me with a rag doll. It's real quick, just so that Tom has. You guys see that?
Yeah, there's that. I love that picture of Alan.
There we go.
Take that
Anybody
in
got
for
a
a moment.
Anybody got a joint?
How old were you then, Al? About?
I don't remember.
Were you in Hawaii?
That was
Yeah.
2 years ago.
That's
Is
fantastic.
it's been a tough two. It's been a really tough 2 years
Tough
for
2
Alan.
years, man. I've lost all that hair in 2 years. That's right. Jesus Christ, Tom.
No,
All right,
you
Raj,
had
you're
some
up.
good hair,
Okay.
man. You did have some
Okay.
good hair.
Well, first, I just want to acknowledge we talk about the concept of acceptance and self-acceptance and acceptance of the world as being paradoxical. And you just referred to that, Tom, as well. But the truth of the matter is, I do think it's paradoxical, but it's also just incredibly confusing a lot of the time, in part because it's paradoxical. Because it's so easy to, for me, in my own mind, even though I've been thinking in these terms for 50 years, thinking about the concept of self-acceptance and its relation to self-esteem. And it's still easy for me to get lost in the meaning of it. So I just want to acknowledge, if you're confused about it at times, join the club. Okay. If you're confused about what it means, if you're confusing it with resignation, if you're confusing it with condoning or supporting things that you don't agree with and don't like, it's easy to do all of that. I referenced that briefly last week when I said there are like 7 different definitions of acceptance in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and some of them connote approval, others don't, and so on. So if there's confusion about this, 2 things: do your best to accept that, because that's what I have to do on any given day. And secondly, realize that with life and with experience and with continuing to think about those things, some of that confusion will resolve itself, especially if we don't pretend to have it resolved before we have, especially if we don't pretend to understand it before we do. And that goes back to what Alan was saying about being willing to accept, I'll put it this way. I tell myself and I tell my clients that the concept of acceptance, properly understood, is always applicable, can always be applied to our perceptions and to our experience. And what I mean by that is, if somebody, to use a trivial example, makes a left turn, or one of my favorite pet peeves in LA at least is, there's a left turn lane on Olympic Boulevard here, and there's a long line of cars in the left turn lane, and the other 3 lanes are straight ahead. And somebody, either because they forgot and decided all of a sudden they wanted to turn, or they just didn't want to wait in the left turn lane, from the lane that's supposed to go ahead, they stop there, 37 cars behind them, and by God, they're going to make a left turn from that lane that's supposed to go ahead. Why does that bother me so much? I could go into that. I was raised by my dad was the principal of the school I went to, so I hold on to some rigidities. So anyway, but here's the thing: accepting reality in that moment doesn't mean, oh, I shouldn't have any feelings about the person that just, held me up because I'm one of the cars behind him or her. But
or pinhead.
Or accepting reality means I am upset about what that person did, And that's the reality of my experience, right?
Yep.
And I also understand, as Charlene did, since she was, in recovery and well versed in the concepts of recovery, that she wanted to get to a place of acceptance eventually. She realized that's where her freedom, and even in her case, the ability to transform this ungodly pain that she was in for years into something that could have some positive dimensions to it
Yeah.
for her in terms of her decision to become a therapist and help other people going through similar pain and so on.
Mhm.
But acceptance isn't just me putting shoulds on myself. It's not me saying, oh, I shouldn't have any negative reactions to other people or to situations or to things that I personally object to, morally object to. Of course I'm going to, and of course I'm going to have those feelings. So acceptance means taking in the whole reality of I want to move in my life toward a position of increasing acceptance. But again, acceptance doesn't mean agreement. Acceptance means I'm acknowledging the reality that this is happening. Now, what I want to do about it is an entirely different issue. I can support it, I can oppose it, I can be neutral toward it. But all of those are parts of what, and again, I'm not expressing it as clearly as I wish I were, but if I just see somebody doing something toward me or toward another, if I see myself doing something toward another person, and I just object to that and say I shouldn't feel that way, I shouldn't react that way, I'm not practicing self-acceptance in that moment. Self-acceptance is me owning and acknowledging what I am experiencing and then exploring that. It doesn't mean necessarily acting it out in that moment, flipping the person off or honking my horn at them or whatever, although I've been prone to that at times in my life as well, right? But it means exploring and being curious about, yeah, where's that coming from for me? What's that about? That reactivity? Is it about rigid belief systems I have about life, or what's it about? So, not knowing if I've helped clarify the notion of acceptance. Acceptance means, as best we can, owning the truth of our experience in the moment, even
Yep.
if it's not, what some idealizing part of ourselves wants it to be. And we can still have aspirations and goals
Shut the fuck
about
up.
who we want to move toward, where we want to go. All right.
Well, that's helpful. The other thing I could differentiate in this chapter was that we're also talking about grief, right? And
Mhm.
someone dealing with a loss, right? And how, acceptance plays such a key role in that experience. And what I was thinking about grief as I was writing down, because another thing that Charlene was teaching us is that when she allowed herself to fully experience her grief, she started to recover the parts of herself that were lost with the loss.
Mhm.
You see, when we invest in something that we lose that part of ourselves that's invested for a period of time. Sometimes it takes a long time to recover that. I remember they used to say, oh, grieving takes about 6 months to a year. And then a bunch of psychologists went out to study that hypothesis. You know what they found,
Mhm.
Raj?
Mhm.
Is that some people could accept things quicker in their life,
Yeah.
depending on the amount of bonding or attachment they had to the particular object that they've lost. Some people, it took years, years. And it was so important that we recalibrated that so nobody had to feel bad if they needed 4 or 5 years to grieve over a very, very meaningful loss in their life. So that's the other thing is that it's very, very important for us to understand, to give us ourselves a space if we're experiencing a loss, to
Mhm.
continue to allow ourselves to grieve and to keep this one Dr. Miller that I've been doing some work, my own personal work with. He says Alan, it's like taking a fishing line with some bait on it and throwing it out in the ocean, reeling it back in and realizing you haven't pulled anything back in but your bait. And doing that maybe 1,000 times before you find a piece of yourself again.
Mhm. Mhm.
So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and open up the the meeting for some shares. We have some time left. Tom, would you like to join us though first and see if there's anything you want to add to sweeten the pot tonight?
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge, and I probably picked it up here, and, but I do some work at a rehab with people who are in IOP, and me and the person that I present with, we encourage people to talk about what do they have problems with in recovery. Like, what do you hate about the 12 steps? Like, tell me what the resistance is. What are you having trouble with accepting? Because as much as I love people who just follow right along, I know that many people, and and from my own experience, have resistance to some concepts and some ideas, and whether it's the meetings themselves or the steps. It's like, so tell me what's the problem, right? What's the resistance? Because I don't know about you, but I was willing to raise my hand in a meeting and go, oh, by the way, this God stuff's bullshit, right? But where do you find the safety to do that, in a forum where someone's willing to listen to you and kind of help you navigate that? So that's the one thing I enjoy about the idea of not just falling into acceptance and it's black or white and you just you have it or not. So it's usually a progression towards acceptance and acknowledging the resistance and acknowledging that I've got a problem with this.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.